I often reflect on repetitivity because I imagine what a young student must think when they bring you a Beethoven sonata that is among the most learned, or any piece which is essential to the repertoire that all pianists want to have studied, which is understandable. It's a gauge for oneself and an aim as well. And how they think about the teacher repetitively teaching this for decades, yearly, and imagining that they think perhaps that it is just a question of repeating one's opinion to the point to which it becomes stiffly wooden in an ideology of a conviction that comes from what you received as a student yourself before you became a teacher, as well as, of course, through the years of your experience. Some more as performers, some more as teachers, but the two experiences or articles written about it, all the ways to nurture the understanding or trying to always go to the essence of the meaning of the piece and how we are to handle it, how to teach it, how to understand it philosophically, pianistically, technically, imagine its other ramifications within orchestral and other genres and styles and colors of instrument timbres, nourish the imagination, unleash the opening and the widening of the horizons of the student while repeating the repertoire. And there's something which is, I think, striking and that students should understand probably, is that the piece itself remains the open question which drives our intellect to be alert and never satisfied with a temporary answer to an eternal question. How to reach that tempo, how to organize that phrasing, how to translate it with a touch, how to make it so that you handle it with a way that is your conviction through an instrument of a temporary usage, basically like a taxi, since pianists don't carry their instrument in general, not even in general, mostly none. And then, therefore, also in an interaction with an acoustic that changes so that your intentions are translated differently. Imagine a sportive of high level having to play a game and then they change the size of, let's say, the court in which they play just because it's randomly so here or there when the piano responds one way with the action or not, the acoustics. And you still have this preparation technically to control through the touch the layers, the phrasing, the articulations, the emotions that are manifested through the harmonic and the polyphonic progressions. In other words, you highlight the piece according to your conviction. And of course, because of the years accumulated of experiences with the piece, not all fingerings fitting every hand, you renew yourself. And then also the fact that the student who, let's say, is in their 20s and discovers the piece for the last month of studying it to prepare it for an exam jury, anything short term, which is part of what schooling is. And you help them to be ready in this very short time when, in fact, pedagogically speaking, we disseminate through our comments, hopefully, elements of fertilization for a garden that they will blossom, and you will see the results of it only after several years of knowing the piece, playing the piece, thinking the piece, questioning the status quo of the understanding of the piece. Therefore, nothing is and shouldn't, I believe, but everybody is different, set in stone. Being flexible, being altruistic, being open with humility towards an understanding, either intuitive by a new student who discovers the piece, and who, through this energy, drive, talent, call whatever you want to call it, and I wonder what it is sometimes, drives them intuitively to make you discover a path in the piece that you never thought of, even after all these years of experience as a performer or as a teacher. Now, the performers improve in performing through the years. The teachers improve also by understanding the piece, because you have inevitably, as a co-pilot, more time to observe what is going on than when you're in the action of doing it. So, of course, when you play a piece, you're self-critical with recording to observe it when you don't play, in between playing it, and you learn about yourself, like in a mirror, like the gesture of the dancer, like the elocution of an actor. All these things are practiced in order to be delivered in the way that the character and the atmosphere of the piece, of the work, of the expert's knowledge of the essence of the humanity that is expressed through a work of art, pictorial, oral, notated, reinvented through improvisation. And I find this reflection very important, because you want to be steady but not static in your opinions, and then let yourself understand that there is always so many ways, not perhaps infinite, who knows, but layers of options that appear obvious to a new gaze at this art form, new look by essence, because it's a new generation, or it's a generation that privileges certain aspects of the art form. Perhaps they don't privilege the philosophical essence. They haven't read books of the literature that can bring you to understand the rapport between the inspiration of the composer and the awareness of the imaginary novels that could have inspired it. And just factually knowing it doesn't help, because you can always go to an article and say, okay, Schumann was inspired by this writer who wrote about this character who he associated to himself, and therefore there is an appropriation of artistic forms that transforms through their art form into something very new. So therefore there is awareness, but to have learned and read it, to have the time or take the time, nobody has the time. Everybody has to be effective and quickly solutioning all the elements of the performance before the essence of the meaning of the performance. So I like to teach with the combination of the two, the short-term success that comes from the handling and the playing of the piece, and then the awareness of the construction that enters in the thought process of the composer. I give you a concrete example today. Take the 7th Sonata by Beethoven in D major. You have a theme that is technically, always in Beethoven, simple in the sense elemental. It's a tetrachord of descending 4 tones, step motion. It's banal by itself. It's not hyper-recognizable. It can enter in any scale. So you wouldn't know it's the theme. Just like in the Appassionata, he uses an arpeggio. By essence, a theme, a motif, is something, or a leitmotif in the Wagnerian sense of the word, is something that you recognize because it's peculiar in its form. like in Debussy when it appears and you're alerted by the pattern. And then you can recognize it even through the piece without having the score. Being aware and careful listener, you can see the evolution of this motif. Of course, you can analyze it on the paper or on the score today on the tablet and see the evolution. And when you see this, you hear, okay. And then you hear the second theme. And you say, well, even if the notation or the grace note ought to be uneven, if not short, but most of the musicologists have, and our own generations past of teachers told us to equalize it, like in the B-flat major Mozart Sonata. The tradition of notating a grace note appoggiatura to the quarter note and the two passing tones, eighth notes. Jeu inégal, as the harpsichordists would say, uneven playing, was the expression of the slight delay of a note that in prior even to the mostly forte piano, the instrument that named after its generally essential effect of expression, is the articulation, the delay of an important note, the rhetoric of mentioning it and then not mentioning it. And therefore, when the sonatas two themes which are supposed to be contrasting according to his teacher Haydn, he's making it so that the first element thematically that you find in the first movement after the introduction of the first theme is in the relative minor, an aria. It comes as the first contrast. It's in minor, it's an aria with accompaniment. And Beethoven uses large arpeggios compared to the recapitulation, which will be on the second degree minor. Which uses really the Alberti bass in its essence, which is broken triads with rhythmic pattern, instead of, because it's technically tight for the tendon and hard for the action of the instrument. And this nourished quasi all the music before Beethoven, who composed for harpsichord, like Haydn, Mozart, and many Johann Christian Bach into early fortepiano. But he uses very large arpeggios in his choice of pattern of accompaniment. And then second time, so is it random? Is it purposeful? Why is it different? How can we know? Who could we ask? How do we look at the ink on the manuscripts to see if it was added, changed? Sometimes we have sources that give us this information because of the layers of writing over or scratching where the composers evolve in their thoughts, and that is something privileged, almost archaeological. For instance, in the end of 109, in first movement of Beethoven's Sonata, he does 5 of 5, and then he adds with a thicker added ink, a suspension to delay the resolution, and then because of the stretch, he places it in the left hand. Okay, so you can argue that it's not possible to find out everywhere, for instance here. Why it's not? Is it because it's too high and it's uncomfortable? Is it just a factual usage of the performer's hand position? But it is to be taken in account when you memorize the piece. Does it change essentially the listener's opinion, understanding of the structure from the detail to the whole? No. It is a fact of a detail, but you observe because you're curious. The devil is in the detail, and you observe the way comes because the recapitulation second theme originally in the relative minor is the principal major key. Therefore, these incarnations at different times of the format that is clearly indicated between the exposition and the recapitulation in the principal key. It's a way to bring things home, unity through essence. Okay, then you got to the point where you're very curious to understand how he deals with the transitions. And you realize that when he uses the same pattern of 4 notes, it's 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 with the provocative for his time period accent on the upbeat, the weak beat, with the sforzando 4 1 2 3, which repeatedly positioned in this fragmented group of 4 notes on each of the octaves of the ranges of the fortepiano, which didn't have as many keys as the modern one, but anyway would be again in fragmentation orchestration pattern when you can hear strings, brass, woodwinds, and that is obvious in his symphonies. And so he thinks the piano as a string quartet, as an aria, as a symphonic organization of patterns that are suggestive of the elements that the instruments do with their timbres. What a brass does, for instance, a French horn, po, 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 po. It will hold the note and the strings would play, or the woodwinds would play the patterns of the exchange of notes of this 4 notes pattern. And then the sforzando is placed between the 2 staves of the piano notated score. And then you can assume it's for the 3 notes. Or you can choose, and I suggest to think about it, not impose, but with conviction. See, I'm trying to be persuasive rather than imposing as a teacher. Perhaps it works more with adults who are already in graduate studies than undergrads, but I still believe in the firm driving the student to not imitate by cloning or by trying to please, because that's also in the exchange of the teaching that is inevitably not at the same level, though the teacher receives a lot from the student's intuition, as I mentioned it. But I find that if I suggest to the student that in an orchestral way the French horn would be heard holding the whole notes, and the pattern of the first theme with the exchange of voices could be heard because of the motion rather than because of the essence, while the instrument of the piano, unlike a French horn, would decay the holding of these notes, therefore it would disappear instead of. So you can suggest, as I do, to highlight that. And in the shifting between the ranges, of course, straight-strung pianos in Beethoven's time had different colors of sound on each of the ranges, which he uses already in the Waldstein, immediately creating spaces. And I don't talk about the late sonatas where he's into the very, very large extreme of his keyboards. And that's also psychological, philosophical, empty of Pascalian statement about the striking fear of the eternal emptiness of the spaces. And so you have that space in the middle that Beethoven leaves empty in the late period. People relate that to his deafness or partial deafness or form of deafness that he had for the late in his life in the medium, and that he could hear the vibrations of the extremes. But for whichever of those reasons, combined or individually justifying, he uses already young, and in this case he's not deaf in the seventh sonata, far from it. He uses the fullness of the ranges expression, and then when you have that shifting 4 1 2 3, you have a gap or a staccato if you lift the hand too early. So what do? You put perhaps a hint of a pedal, like a drop of olive oil or butter. I know most teachers make their analogies with colors. I do it with tastes. Everybody does the analogies they imagine, and sometimes they're silly. But in any case, acoustically, the resonance is meant to also have this little breath between the patterns of 4 1 2 3 and 4 1 2 3. But detached, connected, breathing, staccato, aired, or just the color change. There's so many ways that you can subtly bring this to be. And I find it fascinating that we can be, in imagination, because of the orchestral imagination of the orchestration, either by groupments, as I said, woodwinds, strings, winds, or percussion, or combination of, or tutti for some sections. When he finishes the exposition, and then we have, and that most of the students automatically lift the hands, the octave of the left hand on the beat, and the chord in the suspended, syncopation. But if you put the pedal for the shifting, then you cannot have the staccato of the left hand. And therefore, the decision of Beethoven not to play on the beats, but of the beats, held as if independently, which then implies fingering substitutions to avoid, of course, playing the wrong note. So you have to take a calculated hand management of the sections, so that you can, if you're convinced in the importance, or I have to convince the student of the importance of this delayed suspension, syncopated, of the descending chords in the right hand, with the staccato in the left hand. And pianists in general, playing two hands with two staves most of the time, matching the brain, the eyes, are absorbing the how do I place them together. And when there is a shifting that is uncomfortable, or you're out of fingers, or you didn't do enough substitution, and sometimes nowadays almost no substitution because it's no more fashionable, perhaps mostly because in my time the teachers insisted to play at your lesson legato singing without pedal. Yeah, sure. Well, what do you do with that? You do substitutions. And when you play in performance with the pedal, as I asked why, they said, because you'll use it less as a glue, but more as a coloring effect. Well, a way to trigger the self-search within the student with the technique of the musical aspect of the work, of the aesthetics of the expression, and how all this corresponds to the meaning that you put in the art form that you serve. It's always the micro detail that zoomed out in the macro view of the structure between the thematic materials, the transitions, the choice of modulations, where the musical thought process brings you to by intelligence, by intuition, by provocation, or by provoked surprise, which inevitably theatrically is not so surprising, because when you're aware of an art form, you know that Haydn thought that in a Haydn's sonata form established in the Viennese school, attributed to Haydn, in the principal major key, you have to go to the flat 6 degree, in which case the D major sonata, you have to play in the relatively unexpected compared to relative minor, which would be more expected. Well, all it's relative, because in the today, we're 300 years away from this. We have broken, by so many artists, composers since Beethoven, the art form of the formal presentation of a sonata. And Beethoven himself, already later in his sonatas, starts this erosion, evolution, development, freedom, or freeing from the form, or evolving of the form, a metamorphosis of the sonata form. But within their time period, that was very much of an important moment. When you reach the dominant at the end of the exposition, to start on the flat 6, B flat major. And in the fourth movement, which is a rondo form, as of course most of the sonatas in 4 movements were. After the second was ABA and an aria, and the third was a minuet or a scherzo with a middle section. And the rondo form is ABA-CADA. So therefore, every time you hear it, you come back to this. Then you have something else. Well, he does it in flat 6. But unlike the first movement, where is a subito fortissimo from the decaying resonance of the whole note with fermata. You can also argue that the fermata in Haydn's time indicated or hinted, suggested a cadenza, or like you do in cadenzas of concerti. But this is no more at all in the tradition of today's performance, where we recite the scores published by the editions, who among editions compete to who is more original text, the Urtext that Henley launched and Berenreiter developed, etc. And all editions claim it, because if not, it would be subjectivity is to be erased. Objectivity in editions is to be there, but the subjectivity is in the performer. That is another question, but it comes to mind at the same time, because the students are nourished by hearing many interpretations on a click of a button, which in my generation we didn't have access to, because recordings were rare and expensive, and concerts even more, so that we didn't know how others have gone, especially famous ones or predecessors of us who already died, how they handled the understanding of what is a presto, how much space between the notes, how you scratch the keys to obtain it, etc., or not, or is it wet staccato, is it mezzo staccato, non-legato, portato. I mean, every teacher has their own denomination, and then everybody evaluates the acoustics, what it means to be a staccato that's comic or playful or whimsical, as this could suggest the mood, or is it more severe? So no matter what the notation, the interpretation, translation etymologically brings us to imagine, therefore, when you go to the B flat major in the fourth movement, it's only the tonality surprise, quote unquote, surprise, that comes in the flat 6 quotation of B flat major as an appoggiatura to the dominant by semi-step, hinting minor back in major. That is also an effect that is specifically also a coloristic tonality effect that Haydn suggested. Just like he suggested to have a transitional theme which would appear as the second, when in fact the real second is on the dominant. But is it the real second? Ultimately, with the years of teaching, I start thinking, after all, that's what I was brought to think, because that's what appears from the tonal system, the dominant, the second theme that is brought in. But so then this, is it a decoy second theme? Is it a sidekick motif to prepare us through the relative minor to the dominant? So how you navigate to get there. And then finally, it doesn't matter what you call it, ultimately, I believe. I think it's about mood contrasts, as if you have an aria after a quartet, and then you have paradoxically, probably that's what I thought earlier was provocative, is that his second theme, it's supposed to be the contrasting theme within the pulse, but with a different expression. You have a second theme that is in fact the first. Of course, when you take a theme like Beethoven that's elemental, as I said earlier, anything that is 4-step pattern notes in a row in step motion would be the theme. But factually, he knows how to create diversion through the second theme, which is not really the second theme. And when the real second theme comes, we hear the unity with the first theme, because it reminds us, even if it's different to hear then, and realize that it's the same element, but it's treated in a different character. For instance, the B minor theme, let's call it motif. It's better than call it decoy second theme. I mentioned earlier, it has this accompaniment that is very patterny, that corresponds to what we call Alberti bass. But the second theme doesn't use that pattern. It uses a pattern that is off the beat and that peaks on the downbeat when the right hand drops on the downbeat. And so you have a playful dialogue that is whimsical or humorous. You're not supposed to bring it as much now. For the purpose of the demonstration, I exaggerate. But this is the leading tone dropping. This is 5 of 5 dominant with an accacciatura that is could have been appoggiatura from above, which appoggiare means to lean, or accacciatura is to climb from under. People sometimes call it appoggiatura from underneath. But in any case, it's a note for another. It's not. Well, whatever he could have chosen, but he chose this. Therefore, there is something that you can observe, that if it was on a pattern of accompaniment, as I said earlier, in this is not. He does it just after. Compared to. So you have the displacement of the beat with the syncopation. Da, 2 and 1 and da, da, 2, 2, 2, 1. And he writes presto, which means that in the pulse of a conductor who doesn't play, but impulses the pulse for those who would play string, winds, whatever. I'm not trying to making too much childish demonstration of instrumental imitation. And the sforzando would be woodwinds or brass, and then the descending sixth in the second half of the first theme, which are the opposite of the staccato rambunctious, playful, staccato rising. There's the tenderness of the consecutive 6 chords dropping step motion, which can be handled with, in the right hand, D, E, G, C sharp, and then in the left hand, F sharp, C sharp, E. In other words, out of 3 notes of the 6th chord, first inversion of the triad, you can be playing 2 in the right hand and 1 in the left hand for the first 2, and then 2 in the left hand for the next 2 and 2 in the right hand, so that you have a pedal-less or finger legato, finger pedal, and not a pedal legato, because if you do it all as written, notated, which is not always a translation of the, in my opinion, of the intent of the composer, you're obliged to make that little jump if you keep it all through the descending 6 chords, 2 notes of the triad in the right hand and 1 in the left, which then would call for a pedal to come in, and right foot pedal, cover that gap, which you don't need to if you do the distribution or a redistribution of the 2 hands, which is not notated, but allows to play it with a legato of the fingers without the dampers up, only for those which are played of the notes. But people accept and like. So that's where my tolerance kicks in. I suggest, explain analytically or musically, and therefore pianistically, how I'm brought to handle for the touch control that section. But if the student ultimately plays it with consecutive 5-5-5 with pedal, I disagree, but I accept, not because I want to be without opinion and without imposing it on the student to format the student or train the student, which is a word I don't like to use. I prefer format in the sense to form their own choice rather than impose my through training. But I try to convince through the example as I play it, as I observe how their hands can handle it, because each pianistic hand comes different length of fingers, different space between the fingers, different wrist length. I mean, there is a morphology aspect to how you handle something that is written so many centuries before for an instrument that we don't play, most of us, the fortepiano of Beethoven's time, acoustic decay, sound, pedal, usage that doesn't hold as much, etc. And then straight strung structure, which makes that the basses are separate from the top in the weakness, but these don't have the homogeneity of the sound that comes from the long strings over the medium strings resonating by sympathy, as we say. So we have a different approach from a different perspective of our hearing of the instrument, of the projection, of how the acoustics of today concert halls, recording studios have enhanced certain things and brought to us to hear it in a different level compared to the beautiful visitation of how to perform it on original or copy of an original instrument, with therefore the instrument dictating how you're going to handle the dynamic ranges, the articulations. Here we are in a transposition of instruments. It's really a translation. And when we go to the essence of what we read from the score, student and teacher together, is how to handle this pedestrianly, just at the level of the simplicity of beyond all philosophy of how to organize it symphonically or to organize it in the mood. It has to be played. And then Beethoven adds to this this held sound, the dominant and the tonic, as an oboe would hold in an orchestra, and the strings or the woodwinds we do. let's say 2 clarinets and a bassoon. And so if we play it with pedal, for harmonically, the pedal is there for anything chordal in the tonal system, which is arpeggiated through shelving of thirds, with, of course, inverting and some, the sevenths becoming second, we have dissonances, but most of the time it's shelved by thirds, so you can do. But if you do the same thing in resonance, when you have passing tones by step motion, like the theme is, then obviously, and that most pianists are not bothered by it, which is good because they have a hearing that allows the passing tones to be patterned, put in the pedal, and so you hear. That in an orchestration you cannot obtain. There is no pedal in an orchestration. Even if an orchestration is idealized piano, often the composers write on the keyboard and then distribute the orchestral elements of the colorization of the sounds through the timbres of the instruments, combined or individual, or solo one with others. So, you would never hear that except if an orchestra plays in a church acoustic and you have this overlapping, or an organ in the church, which is acoustically meant for that. So if we look at the fact that we have a staccato and then a legato and a second theme with the left hand and the second motif or first motif, you see how many aspects we have to handle, nothing but by samples, and then put them together in the flow and decide that the presto marking of Beethoven, not using the metronome retroactively at the end of his life, as he did for most of his symphonies on the sonatas, remains after the 1815 Melzel, Viennese marketer of the metronome. This sonata written before remains with the presto marking. So it means rushed, obviously, in Italian, which is obviously more than allegro. And then the meter, the cut time compared to the 4 and the pulse. But again, the conductor uses the pulse but doesn't play. Therefore, when you play each note as a pianist. And it's easier to get into every note a note, rather than the flow of the notes through a group of notes pulsed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Or is it 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Sometimes the pianists, I urge them to count students' loud voice when they practice and in their head when they perform, so they can keep that unit as if they have a conductor within themselves more than a metronome, like Schnabel used to have. Such a knowledge of all the pulses of the metronome from memorized. Curzon, one of his students with whom I studied, told me that he used to tell his students he swallowed the metronome for breakfast, so that you can keep inside you the awareness that if you have tectonic plates with slight difference compared to... And so how do you sew all these elements together in the pulse that is one for all when you look at the score? That's the unity in the diversity of the characters of the themes. That's the purpose of a sonata. Pure music, not only evocative of dances and songs as before on the harpsichord. And of course, the fugal elements of the polyphony is already pure music, as we call it pure. Not lyrics, just the music suggestive by the intervals, but the intervals suggest lyrics. When you have a leap of a sixth or a descent of fourth, the fourth is nor major nor minor, so there is no emotion as much as or a minor or a major sixth. So a lot of the elements that are in the score are there factual for us to play from the notes and the rhythmic values, and therefore, as Ravel used to suggest, one doesn't play me only must play me, doesn't interpret me, meaning you don't have to add a translation of yourself within my music. Don't involve yourself in my music. That's basically what he wanted to say. Thinking or pretending or hoping or perhaps being mostly convinced that the notation of his is what has to be played and nothing more, nothing less. And that is an honesty that we need to bring awareness to the student. We serve the text, we serve the muse, we serve the honesty, we serve the, if not the truth that we perceive in our pursuit, rather, of this essence of the thoughts of the composer through the notation of the composer and then the publications of his works. And of course, when you observe how others translate it or interpret it, we realize that some play and some. So the diversity of the same piece means so many things to so many people, pattern of thinking. A student can be lost if coming to search for a objective truth about the essence of what the piece is supposed to represent, and therefore how they're going to handle it. And not only through the interpretation point of view of the teacher, of another performer, of a great enticing pianist who is fashionable every decade or so, and comes out of fashion or even forgotten with the time. That already happens for recorded industry from almost a century and more. More because of the early 20th when it started, where we have documented performances of pianists, and we go, oh, it's no more played like that anymore, as if there is perhaps, for sure, I must say, there is an evolution of how we hear the music or how we believe in the music, either from the point of view of the liberty that we take in the interpretation with the, let's say, decoration, ornamentation, interpretation through improvisation, which was part of the interpretation. As I mentioned earlier, Haydn suggested this for fermatas. Through the fermatas, to bring some kind of bel canto, little transition, Eingang, as the Germans call it. Today it's not aesthetically allowed, but even within the very notes, without adding any notes, it's how we voice them, how we bring them out. After all, I think there should be, and that I'm convinced that I open the toolbox for the students to search within themselves with my guidance, imposing, suggesting, hinting, repeating. Teachers always do. Even on pieces that are often taught, as I said at the beginning, a reimagination of how you handle the balance between the tempo, post transitions, return. The form doesn't justify the essence, but the essence nourishes the form's experience. It's almost like as if you embed a GPS in the listener who knows where you are in the piece. That's probably one way to imagine the purpose of the form, other than the coherence of the intellect of shaping, as Haydn was probably imagining mankind. Shaping nature in garden landscaping, in architecture, in elements through science of organizing the elements. In other words, there is something about the intellect and then something about the intuition, call it inspiration, talent, pure melodic expression or harmonic colorization and polyphonic blossoming of the texture, to the point to which you have to wonder, what do I bring? How much do I bring? What do I privilege? And such does this, others chose to do that. So with time, ultimately, the student will find what is meaningful to them, picking from fruits of different trees and then making their own syrup. Again, my analogies are food-oriented or taste buds-oriented. But I realized that ultimately the student is their own, and the teacher sitting on the co-pilot seat does not actively play, but actively plays through the student's intentions and try to help to avoid the weaknesses, to avoid the faux pas. But perhaps pedagogically you cannot avoid ahead everything by giving a fingering that handles it better, according to what you think the phrasing should be with articulation, and how much uneven or even, staccato or non-legato, and how the pulse then takes care of everything in the unity of the sonata form with the diversity of the elements that are to be contrasted, and how you handle the transitions to prepare the return of the tempo so it doesn't appear to be coming back at once surprisingly after you lost it, because one thing is to finish as he does in the exposition with half notes when he starts with staccato quarter notes, and he even has eighth notes. This kind of orchestral energy of the quick notes. All the values correspond in ratio. You have 2 eighth notes for a quarter, and two quarters for a half, and 2 halves for a whole note, and then of course the 16th note, the 32nds, the 64s, the 128s. All this structure of the pulse, all the structure of the tonality, all the structure of the melodic lines, all these elements put together beyond only what you discover on the score when you learn it from published score, because it's already there, it's pre-cooked. You just put it on and you sort of microwave it by playing it, but you don't recite it only, you bring it back alive, you give it a new form of life that is through your way of doing. And I find it fascinating, therefore not boring, to repetitively teach the same piece, not necessarily only, of course, but recurrently. And that the piece reveals itself differently for the teacher as well as through the student, and reopens the question of how do I handle this? How do I justify that? How do I understand this? And remain humble at not locking in stiff conclusions from experience and life. And let yourself open to say, I agree to disagree, but it's interesting. Let's explore how that goes. Where does it lead us? And perhaps there aren't that many paths after all once you explored them. But you have to. Just like when I teach by example of how the composer could have, if he didn't, chose a different pattern for an accompaniment, as I mentioned earlier. It embeds, suggests, hints, elements in the hearing that are not perhaps captured on the spot by a more or less trained listener. Like when you listen to something that you're already familiar with the genre and the style, then you're more aware of what is going on or what differs from another aspect, because each sonata is different not only by its inspiration but also by its essence, compared to the fact that it does have common traits because of the form that originally named its title. Sonata comes from that, to resonate. Cantata, to sing, from the Italian and Latin. So obviously it's instrumental, not vocal, but doesn't have lyrics, but suggests through the intervals type of lyrics. So it's a psychological manipulation through the suspension of a chord before in the delayed resolution, perhaps in German and mostly because the verb comes at the end of the sentence. So you could imagine that philosophy, literature, art form, music nourish each other in the understanding of how the structure of the phrase is narrated in the storytelling by a given composer. Syncopations in Schumann, dotted rhythms, unsettled harmonies that are off the beat, like in the fourth movement. You have the dominant in the left hand, and you're still on the tonic in the right hand. Or you could also not bring it out and make it appear like it's just a little erased so that it doesn't shock to have this collision, which of course the audacity of which escapes us today, because obviously the dissonances of today were the consonances, or they will be the consonances of tomorrow, as Mademoiselle used to say. No? And if you don't bring it out, so I think it's interesting, because then it's in your hands, it's in your choices, that as a performer you bring certain things that you think are important to you, the shape, the detail, the essence, and then the way it's managed by the composer. I'd say it's a rabbit hole. I mean, it's never ending, and that's wonderful. Perhaps that's why ultimately justifies to remain enthused when you rediscover the piece through the student. If not the piece, the elements that brought you to think about it when you studied it. But again, when you play it, you're in the pilot seat, not the co-pilot seat. You cannot be and observe at the same time. Well, except when you record yourself, and you can do that analytically. But generally, you're in the action and then the reaction. And then when you listen, you're only in the observation, and you realize if the intention is really successful, if the legato is really so, and if the substitution would help, if the staccato in the left hand doesn't have to be blurred in the pedal for the legato of the right hand that cannot reach the fingers to connect by itself. So at every element, from the detail to the whole, you have choices to make, and I hope to guide them in their own discovery of what it means to them to play it, and then in turn transition to their own transmission of the piece to their own students. And perhaps there are recurrences, and perhaps there are new ways of looking at the same ever-giving fruit through this tree that seems to be the sonata. And it's just a wonderful experience, and humbling, to question your status quo or supposed achievements of awareness, because you question yourself every time you restart the piece. Once all these elements are mentioned, more or less coalesced in the fact of playing it. Conductor doesn't play, orchestra plays. There is an exchange of acceptance. Who decides, who follows? When you play, you have to conduct yourself. You have to play what you chose, what you wished, what you planned. And doesn't come out like you planned, and then you start managing the unexpected, and then the technique comes in to cover that so that it doesn't show off too much, like a bump on the road that you didn't expect. Fascinating, isn't it? Thank you.